You don't belong in first class. The words sliced through the quiet cabin like a final warning nobody asked for. At exactly 6:42 a.m., Gate C-17 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was already crowded with the usual pre-flight tension, rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, the low hum of impatience. But inside the first-class boarding lane, something different was unfolding. A woman stood calmly at the threshold, holding a simple black carry-on, dressed in a plain navy coat and dark jeans, her presence unremarkable to anyone who judged too quickly. Her name was Alicia Monroe, though no one in that moment would have associated her with anything beyond another delayed passenger. Across from her, Flight Supervisor Karen Mitchell held a tablet like a shield, her expression tight, practiced, and absolute. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. "I've reviewed the manifest," Karen said, eyes scanning Alicia up and down with a look that carried more assumption than fact. "Your name isn't cleared for this cabin. Step aside so we can proceed with boarding." Behind her, Flight Attendant Brian Collins shifted closer, arms crossed, reinforcing the silent verdict already forming in the air. Alicia didn't respond immediately. She simply looked past them, toward the jet bridge, where passengers were beginning to filter in, unaware they were stepping into a moment that would soon fracture into something no one would forget. Somewhere behind her, a passenger lifted a phone, casually at first, then with intention, sensing tension the way people sense weather before a storm. "If there's a mistake," Alicia finally said, her voice steady, "you might want to correct it before you proceed further." Karen gave a short, dismissive smile, the kind that comes from believing certainty is the same as authority. "There is no mistake. We've seen this before. People trying to bypass verification because they think they can talk their way into seats they didn't pay for." A few heads turned now. The tone had shifted from procedural to personal, without anyone officially crossing that line. Brian leaned slightly toward Karen and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "We should just clear her and move on. Boarding's already delayed." But Karen didn't move. She tapped her screen once more, as if reinforcing a decision already made. Alicia exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in something closer to quiet calculation. She had seen this pattern before, not here, not in this airport, but in dozens of systems where assumption came before verification. Behind the glass, the cockpit door remained shut, unaware that the next few minutes would begin a chain reaction no checklist accounted for. A nearby passenger, Ethan Brooks, tilted his phone slightly, recording now, whispering under his breath, "This doesn't feel right." Alicia heard him, but didn't turn. Instead, she placed her carry-on gently at her feet and said one sentence that changed the temperature of the entire gate. "Before you make your next decision, make sure you understand who you're speaking to." The air tightened immediately, not with noise, but with anticipation, as if the entire terminal had unknowingly stepped closer to something irreversible. The tension at Gate C-17 did not fade, it deepened in silence. Passengers waiting nearby slowed their movements, their attention pulled toward the small confrontation forming at the first-class boarding lane. Alicia Monroe remained still, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accounted for every possible outcome long before stepping into this moment. Flight Supervisor Karen Mitchell glanced at her tablet again, this time with sharper insistence, as if repetition could turn uncertainty into certainty. "I am going to ask you one more time to step aside," Karen said, her voice controlled but increasingly firm. "If your name is not on the verified priority list, we cannot allow boarding through this cabin." Behind her, Flight Attendant Brian Collins shifted his weight, scanning the growing number of passengers beginning to notice. A few had slowed entirely, their boarding now secondary to the scene unfolding just a few feet away. Ethan Brooks kept his phone angled slightly downward, recording without fully acknowledging it, as though trying to convince himself he was only documenting a delay, not an incident. Alicia finally reached into her coat pocket, not hurried, not defensive, and retrieved a slim black mobile device. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply said, "Before you escalate this further, you should confirm your system logs in real time." Karen let out a short breath, the kind that carried frustration disguised as professionalism. "Our system is already confirmed. We do not process exceptions at the gate without proper clearance." She turned slightly toward Brian, signaling for quiet reinforcement. We are already behind schedule. Alicia unlocked her device and sent a single message. On the other side of the airport, in a private operations suite miles away, a notification chimed softly. Nia Thompson, Alicia's executive assistant, responded immediately without hesitation. Protocol line is active, Nia said through the encrypted channel. All system entries are being mirrored now. Back at the gate, Karen's tablet refreshed on its own. A subtle change appeared on the screen, nothing dramatic, just a shift in status fields that made her pause for half a second longer than she intended. Brian noticed it too, leaning slightly closer. That is strange, he muttered under his breath. Karen ignored him, tapping again as if to override whatever she was seeing. This passenger is not cleared under standard verification, she said aloud now, louder, as if volume could stabilize authority. A few passengers exchanged glances. One older man near the seating area lowered his newspaper completely. Ethan adjusted his phone grip, now fully committed to recording. Alicia looked directly at Karen for the first time since the exchange began. You are looking at incomplete information, she said calmly, and acting on it as if it is final. Karen straightened, her patience thinning. What I am looking at is a system that does not recognize your boarding clearance. At that exact moment, Karen's tablet flickered again, this time more noticeably. A secondary line of data appeared beneath the original manifest entry. It was not something she had requested. It was something that had just been synchronized. Brian leaned in closer, reading silently, his expression shifting, slightly as confusion replaced certainty. Alicia did not move. She simply continued. You should check again before you make a decision you cannot reverse. The boarding gate speaker announced final call for a separate group nearby, but even that sound felt distant now, absorbed by the tightening focus around gate C-17. Karen's confidence held, but only at the surface. Beneath it, the system she trusted was beginning to reflect something she had not anticipated. And for the first time since the interaction began, she did not respond immediately. The notification on Karen Mitchell's tablet did not disappear. It remained there, quietly persistent, as if refusing to be ignored any longer. She tapped it once, then again, her expression tightening with each refresh. Flight attendant Brian Collins leaned closer, now fully aware that something in the system was not behaving as expected. This does not make sense, Brian said under his breath, his confidence thinning into uncertainty. Karen did not respond immediately. Instead, she switched screens, pulling up the full passenger manifest again. Alicia Monroe stood exactly where she had been since the beginning, calm and unmoving, her presence steady in contrast to the growing disruption around her. Ethan Brooks continued recording, his phone now held at chest level, capturing every subtle shift in energy. A few nearby passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. The atmosphere at the gate had changed from routine boarding to quiet anticipation. Karen scanned the updated manifest line by line, and then she stopped. There it was again, a secondary verification layer that had not been visible before. It was not a warning. It was not an error. It was a status confirmation that overrode the standard clearance system. Brian saw it at the same time. That is an executive-level authorization, he said slowly, as if speaking carefully might make it disappear. Karen's jaw tightened. That cannot be accurate, she replied, but her voice carried less certainty than before. She attempted another refresh, her fingers moving faster now, but the result remained unchanged. Alicia finally spoke again, her voice still calm, still measured. You are not looking at a mistake, she said. You are looking at incomplete access. Karen looked up sharply. If you had executive clearance, it would have been flagged immediately during boarding validation. Alicia's gaze did not shift. It was flagged, she said. You chose not to read beyond the first layer. A nearby passenger shifted in their seat, whispering softly to another traveler. The phrase executive clearance had changed the tone of the entire interaction. Ethan adjusted his phone slightly, zooming in without fully acknowledging it. Brian stepped back half a pace, instinctively creating distance from the unfolding uncertainty. Karen tried to regain control of the situation by focusing on procedure. Even if there is a secondary authorization, it must be confirmed by ground control before boarding continues, she said. Her voice was firm again, but it now carried the weight of someone reinforcing rules rather than enforcing certainty. At that moment, Karen's tablet chimed again, a priority notification flashing across the top of the screen. This time she did not ignore it. She opened it immediately. The message was brief, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. It confirmed real-time synchronization with executive-level permissions tied to Alicia Monroe's identity. Brian read it over her shoulder and went completely still. "That is not a standard passenger profile," he said quietly. Karen stared at the screen without speaking. The boarding gate around them seemed to narrow, the noise of the airport fading into the background as focus concentrated entirely on that small device in her hands. Alicia did not move closer. She did not need to. The information had already begun to shift the balance in the room. Karen slowly lowered her tablet slightly, her expression no longer confident, but not yet fully defeated. She looked at Alicia again, this time differently, as if recalculating everything she had assumed from the beginning. And for the first time since the interaction began, she asked a question instead of giving an order. Karen Mitchell did not immediately respond to Alicia Monroe's presence the way she had in the beginning of this interaction. Her posture had changed subtly, no longer fully rigid, no longer fully certain. The tablet in her hands remained the center of her attention, as if she were trying to find a version of reality that aligned with what she had believed only moments earlier. Flight attendant Brian Collins stood slightly behind her now, no longer projecting confidence, but instead watching the screen as if it might reveal a second explanation that had not yet appeared. Around them, the boarding area at Gate C-17 had grown quieter in a way that was not natural for an airport at this hour. Conversations lowered, footsteps slowed, and several passengers openly observed the situation unfolding at the first-class entrance. Ethan Brooks kept his phone steady, his recording now unmistakably focused on the exchange rather than the surrounding environment. Karen finally looked up from the tablet, her voice no longer sharp, but controlled in a different way, as if she was now measuring every word before releasing it. "I am seeing a verified executive-level authorization tied to your identity," she said carefully. "However, this is not something that was present during initial boarding validation." Alicia Monroe did not move, but her expression shifted slightly, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement. "It was never meant to be visible at the first layer," she replied. Brian glanced toward Karen, then toward Alicia, uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. "Then why was it not flagged at the gate system before this moment?" he asked, attempting to re-establish procedural logic in a situation that was no longer behaving procedurally. Alicia turned her gaze toward him briefly. "Because systems reflect what they are instructed to prioritize," she said. "And sometimes, the first instruction is shaped by assumption rather than verification." That statement lingered in the air longer than expected. A nearby passenger lowered their voice completely, no longer whispering, but simply listening. Karen's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tablet. She opened another tab, pulling up the full audit trail. As the data loaded, a second layer of system logs appeared, showing a sequence of verification steps that had been bypassed during manual review at the gate. Brian noticed it first and exhaled slowly. "That should not be possible without override clearance," he said. Karen did not correct him this time. Instead, she focused entirely on the timeline displayed in front of her. It showed that Alicia Monroe's identity had been authenticated through multiple secure channels before arrival, but those confirmations had not been integrated into the final boarding interface used at Gate C-17. Ethan shifted his phone slightly higher, capturing Karen's reaction as it changed from confusion to something closer to realization. Alicia remained composed, her voice steady and uninterrupted by the unfolding discovery. "You were given partial data," she said, "and you made a complete decision from it." Karen finally lowered the tablet slightly, her eyes meeting Alicia's directly for the first time without procedural distance between them. The weight of the situation had shifted, not through confrontation, but through confirmation. Brian stepped back another half step, no longer participating, only observing as the structure of authority he had relied on began to fracture quietly in front of him. The gate agent at the far end of the boarding lane hesitated, no longer announcing boarding groups, waiting instead for instruction that had not yet come. Alicia did not advance, did not demand, did not raise her voice. She simply stood in place as the system around her continued to correct itself in real time. And for the first time since this interaction began, Karen Mitchell no longer tried to assert control over it. The silence at gate C-17 shifted into something heavier, not empty but loaded, as if every second was being measured against a decision that had already begun without anyone announcing it. Karen Mitchell stood with her tablet lowered slightly, her eyes no longer scanning data but absorbing it, as though she was trying to reconcile what the system was showing with what she had already declared moments earlier. Flight attendant Brian Collins remained close, no longer speaking, his attention divided between Karen's screen and Alicia Monroe's steady presence. The boarding line behind them had slowed almost completely, passengers no longer pretending to be disengaged, several openly watching with phones still in hand, recording without commentary. Ethan Brooks had stopped adjusting his angle, now holding his device still, capturing the stillness itself as part of the moment. Karen finally spoke, but her voice had lost its earlier procedural certainty. There has been a system mismatch between gate verification and central authorization layers, she said carefully, as if choosing words that would not break further consequences into motion. Brian looked at her quickly. Does that mean we cannot proceed with boarding? He asked. Karen hesitated, and in that hesitation something unspoken filled the space. Alicia Monroe remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, but her attention now rested on Karen with quiet focus. You are no longer operating with full system visibility, Alicia said calmly. Karen tightened her grip on the tablet again. That is not how our operational structure is designed, she replied. But even as she said it, her tone lacked the force it had carried earlier. The tablet chimed again, this time with a priority escalation alert that bypassed her manual control. Karen's eyes flicked to it immediately. Brian saw the change in her expression before she even opened it. What is it now? He asked, but Karen did not answer right away. She opened the notification and froze for a brief moment that lasted longer than it should have. The message confirmed that real-time audit protocols had been activated at executive-level authorization, and that all gate-level decisions involving Alicia Monroe were now under direct review by airline operations headquarters. A second message followed almost instantly, confirming that supervisory authority at Gate C-17 had been temporarily suspended pending live compliance review. Karen's breathing changed slightly, subtle but noticeable. Brian stepped back half a step without realizing it. Karen, he said quietly, what does that mean for us right now? She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked past Alicia toward the boarding area as if searching for something stable to hold on to, but nothing in the environment offered that anymore. A voice came through the intercom near the gate desk, calm and official, requesting immediate confirmation of gate supervision status. Karen lifted her head slightly, finally responding. This is Flight Supervisor Mitchell, she said, her voice now noticeably restrained. We are currently under review due to system-level authorization conflict. A brief pause followed on the other end, then a request for her to remain on standby while operations completed verification. The phrase "remain on standby" echoed more heavily than it should have in a place designed for constant movement. Alicia finally stepped forward for the first time, not toward confrontation, but simply closer to the boarding threshold. This is no longer about access, she said quietly. It is about accuracy. Karen looked at her, and for the first time there was no procedural reply ready. Behind them, Ethan's recording captured the shift clearly, passengers no longer reacting with confusion or curiosity, but with quiet realization that the authority in front of them was no longer functioning as a single source of control. Brian glanced toward the boarding door, then back to Karen, waiting for instruction that did not come. And in that pause, the structure Karen had relied on began to give way, not through force, but through confirmation she could no longer override. The operational silence at Gate C-17 was no longer passive. It had become structured, almost procedural, as if the entire environment had shifted into a different mode of reality. Karen Mitchell stood near the gate podium with her tablet angled downward, her eyes no longer fixed on Alicia Monroe, but on the cascading system updates that continued to override her previous authority. Flight attendant Brian Collins remained slightly behind her, no longer attempting to interpret the situation, only reacting to each new change as it appeared. The boarding process had fully stalled, with passengers no longer advancing or retreating, simply observing the unfolding breakdown of standard protocol. Ethan Brooks kept his phone steady, his recording. now capturing not just individuals, but the collapse of control itself. Karen finally spoke into her headset, her voice controlled but noticeably restrained. "This is Flight Supervisor Mitchell requesting immediate clarification on executive override status affecting Gate C-17 operations," she said. A brief pause followed before a response returned, calm and official, confirming that all gate-level authority decisions involving Alicia Monroe were now subject to direct executive compliance review. Brian exhaled slowly, stepping slightly to the side, as if creating physical space might help him process the shift in hierarchy. "So we are no longer in control of boarding decisions," he said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition. Karen did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her tablet further and looked at Alicia Monroe again, this time without procedural framing, without system dependency, only direct acknowledgement of presence. Alicia remained composed, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Control was never the point," she said. "Accuracy was." At that moment, Karen's headset chimed again, followed by a second voice entering the channel, this one from Airline Operations Headquarters. The tone was firm, but no longer uncertain. "Gate C-17 Supervision Authority is suspended pending full compliance audit. All decisions are to be paused until further instruction." The word paused carried through the space like a physical weight. Brian looked toward the boarding door, then toward the passengers, then back to Karen, realizing there was no longer a direction to follow. Karen's grip on the tablet loosened slightly. For the first time, she did not attempt to refresh the system or override the notification. Instead, she stood still, absorbing the implication of what had already been decided beyond her reach. Alicia took one small step forward, not aggressive, not demanding, but enough to close the distance that had defined the entire interaction. "You were operating with partial visibility," she said calmly. "And now the full picture has arrived without your permission." Ethan's recording captured Karen's expression changing subtly, not into anger or resistance, but into something closer to realization that the framework she trusted had been reassigned above her level. Passengers near the gate began to shift slightly, some lowering their phones, others simply watching without movement. The announcement board above them updated automatically, briefly flashing a status change for boarding operations at Gate C-17. No further instructions followed. Karen finally lowered her tablet completely, holding it at her side. Brian no longer spoke. And in that moment, the authority that had defined the space earlier was no longer being challenged. It was simply no longer active. The announcement overhead at Gate C-17 did not continue after the suspension notice. Instead, it went silent in a way that felt more deliberate than technical, as if the entire airport had briefly stepped outside its normal rhythm. Karen Mitchell stood with her tablet lowered at her side, no longer attempting to interpret updates or challenge system behavior. Flight attendant Brian Collins remained still, his attention no longer divided between screens and people, but fully fixed on the unfolding situation in front of him. Passengers who had been recording began to lower their phones slightly, not out of instruction, but out of uncertainty about what would happen next. Ethan Brooks continued to film, but even his framing had shifted, now centered entirely on Alicia Monroe rather than the surrounding environment. Alicia took a slow step forward, closing the remaining distance to the gate podium. Her movement was calm, measured, and unaccompanied by urgency. When she spoke, her voice carried evenly across the space without effort. "At this point," she said, "you are no longer making boarding decisions. You are observing confirmation." Karen looked at her, her expression no longer defensive, but unsettled in a quieter way, as if the structure she had relied on was no longer available for reference. "Confirmation of what exactly?" Karen asked carefully, no longer issuing commands, only seeking definition. Alicia did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her phone, unlocking it without haste. On the screen, a single secure line connected automatically. Within seconds, a voice came through, clear and direct, identifying itself as Airline Operations Executive Control. All gate-level systems for C-17 are now fully synchronized with Executive Authorization Layer, the voice said. Final identity verification is complete. Karen's eyes flicked toward the tablet still in her hand, then back to Alicia. Brian took a small step backward, not leaving, but no longer aligned with any role he previously held in the interaction. Alicia finally spoke again, her tone unchanged. "There is no discrepancy anymore," she said. "Only acknowledgement." The operations voice continued briefly, confirming that all prior manual overrides at the gate level had been logged, reviewed, and superseded by verified executive access credentials. Karen's grip on the tablet loosened completely. She did not drop it, but she no longer engaged with it. The device that had defined her authority minutes earlier now sat inactive in her hands. A few feet away, Ethan adjusted his recording slightly, as if anticipating a moment that required full framing. Alicia turned slightly toward the boarding lane, then back toward Karen. "You were given incomplete visibility," she said, not as accusation, but as fact. "And you made decisions within that limit. That is now recorded." Karen nodded once, slowly, without speaking. The weight of the situation was no longer in dispute resolution, but in recognition of a hierarchy that had already resolved itself beyond the gate. Brian finally lowered his gaze, no longer observing the system or the people, but the outcome. Alicia did not raise her voice, did not signal for attention, did not request acknowledgement. She simply stood in place as the confirmation finalized across the system she had activated. And in that moment, Gate C-17 was no longer a point of conflict, but a completed transition of authority that no one present could reverse. The atmosphere at Gate C-17 had shifted into a state of complete procedural silence, not because activity had stopped, but because authority had already been redistributed beyond the visible space. Karen Mitchell stood near the gate podium, with her tablet lowered at her side, no longer interacting with it. Her posture reflecting a recognition that the system she once controlled was now operating independently of her input. Flight attendant Brian Collins remained nearby, but he no longer attempted to interpret updates or maintain operational readiness. His role in the moment had dissolved into observation. Passengers who had once been actively recording or reacting had now become still, their attention fixed on the absence of further escalation rather than the escalation itself. Ethan Brooks held his phone steady, capturing the quiet aftermath as much as the preceding events. Alicia Monroe remained in the same position she had held throughout, her presence unchanged, her attention directed forward toward the gate structure as though waiting for final confirmation rather than additional action. A subtle notification appeared on the gate display system, not announcing delay or boarding, but confirming a full operational status transition. Karen saw it first. Her eyes moved to the screen, then briefly to Alicia, then back again. She did not speak. Brian noticed her silence and followed her gaze. The display confirmed that all manual gate-level authority had been permanently logged, archived, and reassigned under executive authorization protocol. There was no instruction for reversal, no pending review, only completion. A voice came through the operations channel one final time, calm and precise, stating that Gate C-17 had been returned to standard boarding flow under centralized control and that all prior supervisory actions had been recorded for compliance review. Karen slowly placed her tablet on the edge of the podium. The movement was careful, deliberate, and final in its implication. She did not attempt to reopen any system interface. She did not challenge the update. Brian exhaled quietly, looking toward the boarding lane where passengers now stood without instruction, waiting for a signal that would no longer come from local authority. Alicia finally turned slightly, not toward Karen, but toward the gate itself. "The process has concluded," she said calmly. Her voice carried evenly, without emphasis, as if stating an outcome already understood at a higher level. Karen nodded once, her expression no longer resisting the situation, only absorbing it. Ethan adjusted his recording slightly, capturing the stillness that followed, where no further correction was required and no further dispute remained active. The environment at Gate C-17 had not erupted, had not collapsed, but had instead transitioned into a finalized state of resolution where authority was no longer contested because it had already been determined elsewhere. Alicia remained for a moment longer, then simply stood in quiet alignment with the resolved system state. And in that stillness, what had begun as denial had fully completed its transformation into irreversible acknowledgement. The final confirmation at Gate C-17 did not arrive with noise or disruption, but with a quiet finality that settled over the entire boarding area, like a completed process rather than an unfolding event. Karen Mitchell stood near the gate podium with her tablet, now resting motionless on the surface beside her, no longer active in her decision-making. Flight attendant Brian Collins had stepped slightly back from his earlier position, his attention no longer directed at interpreting system updates or maintaining procedural control, but instead at observing the absence of any remaining authority to exercise. The passengers who had once been filming, whispering, and reacting now stood in a subdued stillness, their phones lowered or held loosely at their sides, as if the urgency to document had been replaced by the realization that the outcome was already fully determined. Ethan Brooks kept his recording active, but his framing had shifted entirely toward the still center of the scene, capturing the aftermath rather than the conflict. Alicia Monroe remained where she had been, her posture unchanged throughout the entire sequence, her presence steady in a way that no longer required interpretation or validation. A final system notification appeared across the gate display, confirming that all prior supervisory actions had been permanently closed under executive resolution and that Gate C-17 operations had returned to centralized control status. There was no further instruction, no pending review, and no additional directive for local staff intervention. Karen looked at the screen for several seconds without moving, absorbing the finality of what had already been executed beyond her level of authority. Brian exhaled quietly, no longer attempting to engage with any procedural framework, recognizing that the structure he had relied upon throughout his role in the interaction was no longer active in this context. Alicia finally turned slightly toward the boarding lane, not to assert control, but to acknowledge completion. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and unhurried, carrying no emphasis beyond clarity. "This process is complete," she said. The words did not introduce change, they confirmed it. Karen gave a small, restrained nod, not as compliance, but as recognition that the sequence had ended without requiring further intervention from her side. Ethan's recording captured the final stillness, where no additional corrections were issued and no further disputes remained unresolved. The environment that had once been defined by disagreement and procedural escalation now existed in a state of closure, where authority had already been transferred, recorded, and finalized beyond the visible space. Alicia remained for a brief moment longer, then simply stood in alignment with the resolved outcome, as the boarding area returned to its natural flow under centralized control. And in that final silence, what had begun as exclusion had fully transformed into confirmation, leaving behind a completed system and a moment that no longer required response.